The Glider Pilot Regiment had among the highest casualty rates of any British regiment in the Second World War. Not because their gliders crashed, because of what happened after they landed. Every video you've ever watched about wartime gliders makes the same mistake. They obsess over the aircraft. Wingspan, payload, how the nose hinged open, how many troops you could fit inside a Horsa. And then, somewhere in the last 90 seconds, almost as a footnote, oh, and the pilots also fought on the ground. That's where those videos end. That's where this one begins. Because these men weren't pilots, not in the way that word normally works. They were soldiers who happened to fly. And the flying was the easy part. But first, let's deal with the thing someone in the comments is already typing. Yes, Germany had a bigger glider. The Messerschmitt Me 321 Gigant carried a payload of approximately 20,000 kilograms, which dwarfed anything the British or Americans flew. That's not disputed. But the Gigant was a transport aircraft, a flying cargo hold that required either a specially built twin-fuselage Heinkel He 111 Zwilling or a dangerous rocket-assisted takeoff just to get airborne. Its job was moving supplies behind established lines. The British Hamilcar did something entirely different. It was purpose-built to deliver Tetrarch and Locust light tanks, along with 17-pounder anti-tank guns, directly into contested landing zones during active combat. The Gigant delivered cargo. The Hamilcar delivered armour into a firefight. That distinction, transport versus tactical weapon system, is the reason we're here talking about the Hamilcar's crews and not the Gigant's. 2 sentences on specs, that's all you need. Now let's talk about the men. The Glider Pilot Regiment was formally inaugurated on the 24th of February 1942, though permission to form it had been granted 2 months earlier on the 21st December 1941. The man who shaped it into what it became was Colonel George Chatterton, born December 2nd, 1911, charismatic, demanding, and possessed by a single idea he called the total soldier concept. What that meant, stripped of any romanticism, every man who flew a glider for the British Army would be trained not just as a pilot, but as a fully qualified infantryman, capable of fighting on the ground the moment his aircraft stopped moving. Weapons qualification, fieldcraft, section-level tactics, close-quarters combat, grenade handling, perimeter defence, the complete package. And this wasn't some aspirational motto stitched onto a regimental banner to impress visitors at mess dinners. It was an operational necessity imposed by the physics of glider warfare itself. There was no engine, no fuel, no return flight. Once the tow rope released and the glider committed to its landing zone, the pilot's job as an aviator was finished, permanently, and his job as a soldier began. The aircraft was, by design, disposable. The man inside was not. Chatterton refused to let trained men sit idle behind a wrecked fuselage while a battle raged around them. The regiment sat within the Army Air Corps alongside the Parachute Regiment. But glider pilots were Army, not RAF. A distinction that shaped everything from their rank structure to their combat expectations. First pilots held the rank of staff sergeant. Second pilots were sergeants, and they answered to Army chain of command, even though they flew aircraft. Infantry discipline, infantry fitness standards, infantry weapons qualification, from day one. Chatterton spelled this out in his memoir, Wings of Pegasus. The regiment would produce men who could land a Horsa in darkness on an unmarked field, climb out, and immediately function as an effective section within a fighting platoon. Not eventually, immediately. So what did training actually look like? Volunteers could come from any regiment or corps in the army. Those accepted started with RAF elementary flying training in powered aircraft before converting to gliders at the Glider Conversion Unit. Locations included Bryce Norton, among others. The initial trainer was the General Aircraft Hotspur, a light glider for teaching the fundamentals of unpowered flight, before students graduated to the operational airspeed Horsa and, for the select few, the massive Hamilcar. But calling this process training makes it sound controlled, safe. It was neither. Gliders don't give second chances. There's no engine to apply when an approach goes wrong, no throttle to push forward if you undershoot, no powered go-around when the landing zone's obstructed or the crosswind shifts at the last second. Every single landing is a commitment. Every error is final. Night flying with no instruments capable of measuring exact altitude. Heavy-type conversion with aircraft that handled like loaded furniture vans. Formation approaches in poor visibility, where one misjudgment killed everyone aboard. The sheer dead weight of a loaded Horsa, which could carry 28 troops, or a jeep and trailer, or an anti-tank gun with its crew. All of it pulling you earthward with no possibility of a reprieve. Training fatalities weren't anomalies. They were structural features of the program. Some classes reportedly suffered fatality rates approaching 50% before the surviving pilots were declared operational. One account passed down among veterans' families, the kind of detail that survives at kitchen tables long after the official records stop caring, describes a Spitfire pilot's son recounting that his father's training class lost 34% of its number. Not in combat, in training. And these weren't raw 18-year-old recruits learning which end of a rifle to point forward. Many were experienced soldiers who'd already proven themselves in other branches of the service, funneled into a role that turned out to be statistically more dangerous than what they'd left behind. The infantry training was equally unforgiving. Glider pilots qualified on the Sten gun, the Lee Enfield rifle, the Webley revolver. They drilled with grenades, practiced platoon-level maneuvers, learned to set up defensive positions and hold them under pressure. They trained specifically, repeatedly, obsessively for the one scenario they would face in every operation they'd ever fly. Arriving in a contested zone, carrying nothing more than what fit on their person, and being expected to hold ground until relieved. A man who could fly a glider but couldn't clear a trench was useless to the airborne plan. A man who could do both was the total soldier. And on the night of July 9th, 1943, the regiment found out what that really cost. Operation Ladbroke, the glider component of the Allied invasion of Sicily, was, by any honest assessment, a disaster. Of 144 gliders launched, 69 came down in the Mediterranean Sea. Men drowned in the darkness, trapped inside wooden fuselages that broke apart on impact with the water, or sank before they could cut themselves free. Only 54 gliders reached land in Sicily. Only one landed on the correct target. High winds, poor navigation, and inexperienced American tow pilots from the 51st Troop Carrier Wing, who released too early and too far from the coast, turned a bold plan into a catastrophe. Chatterton himself was among those who made it to the island, and his fury at the tow pilots and at the planning assumptions that had put his men in that position became a defining feature of his command for the rest of the war. But here's the thing nobody mentions about Sicily. The men who did reach the Ponte Grande Bridge, a tiny, stubborn handful who'd landed where they were supposed to, held it for hours against Italian counterattacks before being overwhelmed. And the casualties among those who made it ashore came from ground combat, not the flight, not the landing, the fighting afterward. Sicily proved the total soldier concept in the most brutal way imaginable. The men who survived the water, who clawed ashore or slammed onto solid ground in darkness, immediately had to pick up their weapons and fight. And they did. Normandy was different. Normandy was Vindication. 6 Horsa gliders, D Company, 2nd Battalion, Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry under Major John Howard. Released over the Normandy coast in the early minutes of June 6, 1944, with orders to capture 2 bridges spanning the Caen Canal and the River Orne. The first glider was piloted by Staff Sergeant Jim Woolwork, 24 years old, a man who'd practiced this exact approach so many times he could reportedly fly it in his sleep. Woolwork brought his Horsa down in total darkness, without instruments capable of measuring his precise altitude, aiming for a tiny strip of earth beside the canal bridge. The landing was so violent it tore through barbed wire and boundary fences before the nose crumpled and drove into the ground. Woolwork and his co-pilot, Staff Sergeant John Ainsworth, were thrown forward through the cockpit perspex and knocked unconscious. But the aircraft stopped within 50 yards of the bridge. Within minutes, Howard's men had stormed the defences and taken it in a coup de main that military academies still teach today. The bridge was later renamed Pegasus Bridge, after the airborne forces insignia. And now, the part every other account skips past. Woolwork, when he regained consciousness, didn't radio for evacuation, didn't sit beside his wrecked aircraft waiting for the infantry to handle things. He picked up his weapon and joined the perimeter defence. So did every other glider pilot from those 6 Horsas who could still stand. This wasn't heroism in the spontaneous sense. It wasn't battlefield improvisation born from chaos. It was standing orders. And this is where the script earns the title on the screen. What did glider pilots do after landing? They fought. Here's exactly how. Every glider pilot who landed in Normandy, or Sicily, or Arnhem, or the Rhine, carried personal weapons on his body during the flight, stowed within arm's reach in the cockpit. Sten guns, Lee Enfield rifles, Webley revolvers, grenades in pouches on their webbing, loaded magazines for the Sten. The moment the glider stopped moving, pilots had standing orders. Unload your cargo or passengers, report to a pre-designated rendezvous point, form up into ad hoc platoons alongside other glider pilots, and take up assigned defensive positions. They weren't reinforcements in the traditional sense. They didn't arrive later. They were already inside the perimeter from the first seconds of the operation. The first warm bodies available to plug a gap in the line. And they were expected to hold. Hold for how long? That depended on the operation. At Normandy, the 6th Airborne Division's positions east of the Orne needed to be secured until the seaborne forces linked up, which took days. At Arnhem, they were supposed to hold until the relieving force arrived overland. The relieving force never arrived. The glider pilots held for 9 days. On the ground, their roles were indistinguishable from regular infantry. Perimeter defence, anti-tank positions when they'd landed 17-pounders, reconnaissance patrols into ground nobody else had mapped yet, ammunition resupply runs under fire, casualty evacuation under fire. And when a section got chewed up and there weren't enough paratroopers or air landing troops left to fill the gap, glider pilots filled it. Not because they volunteered, because that was the plan. Had been since Chatterton drew it up. Across Normandy's evening lifts on the 6th of June and the days that followed, further waves of Horsas and Hamilcars delivered anti-tank guns, jeeps, ammunition and reinforcements to the 6th Airborne Division. Glider pilots from every lift fought in the hedgerows and fields alongside paratroopers and air landing battalions. Every surviving pilot spent days, not hours, days in ground combat before being extracted. carrying the same Sten gun they'd flown in with. The casualty rate among glider-borne infantry in Normandy ran close to 11%, and glider pilots fought in identical conditions. Normandy proved Chatterton's doctrine right. His men could fly with surgical precision, land under fire, and hold a perimeter against German counterattack. But it also confirmed a truth the regiment would carry for the rest of the war. The flying was the easy part. Then came Arnhem. And Arnhem broke something that couldn't be mended. On September 17, 1944, the Glider Pilot Regiment flew into Operation Market Garden, Montgomery's gamble to seize a corridor of bridges across the Netherlands and punch through into Germany. The British 1st Airborne Division drew the worst possible assignment: capture and hold the road bridge at Arnhem, the furthest bridge from Allied lines, the one that had to be held longest before relief arrived. A bridge too far. You know how that ends. Glider pilots flew in across multiple lifts. First wave on September 17th landed on zones west of Arnhem, several miles from the bridge itself. Chatterton had argued for a small glider force to land directly beside the southern end of the bridge and seize it quickly. His request was denied. So the landing zones stayed distant, and the march to the bridge consumed precious hours, while German resistance hardened from surprised disorganization to ferocious coordinated defense. The pilots landed, unloaded their aircraft, formed up into their platoons, and walked straight into a ground war that would last 9 days. What followed tested the total soldier concept to destruction. As the 1st Airborne Division was compressed into an ever-shrinking perimeter around the village of Oosterbeek, glider pilots fought in the defensive line shoulder to shoulder with paratroopers from the Parachute Regiment, air landing troops from the Border Regiment and the King's Own Scottish Borderers, and whatever other fragments of shattered units could be scraped together. They manned trenches. They repelled infantry assaults, not one, not two, but repeated attacks by German forces whose resistance had stiffened from surprised to ferocious. They fought in the gardens and ruined houses of a quiet Dutch village that was being systematically levelled around them. As the days wore on, unit distinctions blurred. Survival came down to who could still hold a weapon and who couldn't. Glider pilots served as ammunition runners, carrying boxes of rounds forward to positions that were running dry. They carried wounded to aid posts that were themselves under fire. And when men in the trench beside them were killed, they took over those positions, picking up whatever weapon was available, because their own Sten had jammed or run dry days ago. Sergeant Frank Hughes left an account of his position on the Oosterbeek perimeter, facing east toward the bridge, with the shrinking line at his back, fighting in conditions no amount of training could have fully prepared anyone for. Not because the training was inadequate, because Arnhem exceeded anything anyone had planned for. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission records 220 men of the Glider Pilot Regiment killed at Arnhem. 220 dead from a flying regiment, a unit that, on paper, was supposed to deliver things and go home. Hundreds more were wounded or taken prisoner. When the remnants of the 1st Airborne were evacuated across the Rhine on the night of 25th to 26th September, Operation Berlin, the withdrawal every survivor remembered until the day they died, many glider pilots were among those who didn't make it across. Some were captured. Some evaded with help from the Dutch resistance and filtered back to Allied lines over weeks or months. Some vanished into the chaos of those final days at Oosterbeek and were never conclusively accounted for. The regiment went into Arnhem as glider pilots. Those who came out, and not all of them did, came out as infantry veterans of one of the most savage small unit battles the British Army fought in the entire war. And then, impossibly, they were asked to do it again. Operation Varsity, 24th of March 1945, the airborne crossing of the Rhine, the largest single-day airborne operation ever mounted. Over 1,500 gliders and transport aircraft carrying elements of the British 6th Airborne Division and the American 17th Airborne across the river onto the eastern bank. Germany was visibly crumbling. The war was weeks from ending. This should have been the last chapter. The regiment's final flight with the finish line in sight. Instead, it became the bloodiest single day in the Glider Pilot Regiment's existence. Over 20% of the glider pilots who flew into Varsity were killed or wounded in a single day. But the composition of those casualties tells a story far darker than the number alone. Approximately 60% of the glider pilots who died at Varsity were not veterans of the regiment. They were Royal Air Force men, power pilots, trained to fly Spitfires, Hurricanes, Lancasters, who'd been hastily converted to glider operations to fill the gaping holes torn by Arnhem. These men received 14 days of small arms training at Fargo Camp and a compressed glider conversion course that bore no resemblance to the months-long total soldier program Chatterton had built. They learned to fly a Horsa. They were handed a Sten gun, and they were sent across the Rhine into landing zones raked by concentrated German anti-aircraft fire, with standing orders that prohibited evasive action on approach. Sit with that for a moment. A man trained to fly a Spitfire, an aircraft with an engine, with speed, with the ability to climb, turn, fight back and fly home. Strapped into a wooden box with no power and no armour, gliding into a field where people are trying to kill him, landing, if he lands, climbing out and being expected to fight as infantry, with a weapon he'd trained on for 2 weeks, against German soldiers who'd been fighting for years. 14 days of preparation, approximately 60% of the dead. That single statistic is the final, devastating proof of what Chatterton understood from the beginning. The total soldier concept wasn't military vanity, wasn't regimental pride dressed up as doctrine to impress the brass. It was the difference between life and death. And when it was abandoned, when expediency replaced training and men were thrown into the post-landing fight without the infantry skills they needed, they died at rates that dwarfed even the regiment's already brutal averages. So, what did glider pilots do after landing? They didn't wait for extraction. They didn't stay with their aircraft. They grabbed Sten guns and rifles and revolvers, formed into platoons, reported to rendezvous points, and fought. They defended perimeters, ran ammunition under fire, carried wounded on their backs, cleared enemy positions with grenades, and held ground, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days. At Arnhem for 9 consecutive days, alongside paratroopers and air-landing infantry. Not as auxiliaries, as equals. Not because they chose to on the spur of the moment, but because it was the plan from the day the regiment was born on the 24th of February, 1942. And they died doing it. Not in crashes, not on landing. In the mud, the rubble, the hedgerows and the ruined gardens of Dutch villages, with a Sten gun in their hands and standing orders that said, "Hold until relieved." 220 killed at Arnhem alone. Over 20% casualties in a single day at Varsity. Training classes where a third of the men never made it to operations. And across 4 major campaigns, Sicily, Normandy, Arnhem, the Rhine, a cumulative toll that placed this regiment among the most blooded in the entire British Army. Not bad for a unit most histories file under transport. Here's what remains unclear, even now. The full accounting of what happened to every glider pilot who survived the Oosterbeek perimeter. The ones taken prisoner. The ones who evaded through the Dutch countryside. The ones who simply disappeared in those final chaotic days of September 1944 and were never traced. If your father or grandfather was one of those men, if you know their story, what happened to them after Arnhem, leave it in the comments below. Subscribe for more stories like this one.